In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
So there are three key levers for changing or shaping or influencing behavior, or that influence our behavior. The first is our instincts, so the instincts to survive, or the instinct to eat, or the instinct to protect one's offspring. And these are very hardwired, but they do influence our behavior. But again, very hard to change your instinctual response. The second one, as you mentioned, Aga, is our personality. So our personality, whether we're outgoing or we're gregarious or we're generous or we have a trigger-haired temper, some of these things are personality-driven and, again, deeply wired and quite hard to change. And some would also argue, well, what right do we even have to try and change people's personality and who they are at work? And, what right do we have to even ask people to do that? But then the third way, and I think, sometimes the easier way, is to reframe the role.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hello from the red zone of coronavirus epidemic. It's episode 56 of the Culture Lab, and as I'm recording this, I'm officially under quarantine alongside other 16 million people in Italy. It's pretty weird, but we're coping well for now, and I hope that the same goes for you wherever you are on this planet. Okay, so let's go to today's episode. Today, my guest is Siobhan McHale, a culture change specialist. She's worked across 4 continents, helping thousands of leaders to create more agile and productive workplaces. She has been on the inside as the executive in charge of change in a series of large multinational organizations. And in this episode, we will be talking about everything that she has learned in her long and successful career. If you struggle with some aspects of your corporate culture and feel like you need a serious culture shift, some of the concepts that Siobhan shares with me in this interview will be extremely useful to you. Okay, so here we go. Here is Siobhan McHale. So Siobhan, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thank you, Aga. Lovely to speak with you today.
Lovely to speak to you too. And how wonderful is it that you are sitting in Melbourne and I'm sitting in Milan and we're having this conversation. It's really early in the morning for you and quite late at night for me.
It is the power of technology. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And we've been aware of each other for a while through LinkedIn, and I know your work. I was really impressed with the messages that you put across in your book and the tremendous experience that you've had. So I really can't wait to have this chat with you. But before we go there, I just want to ask you to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure, Aga. I'm Siobhan McHale, and I'm the Executive General Manager of People, Culture and Change at DuluxGroup, which is an international paint company based in Melbourne, Australia.
Wonderful. And one question that I ask each of our guests is the following. What were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? So how did you grow up and how do you think it influenced who you are today?
Mm. I grew up in Ireland, so my name Siobhan is actually Gaelic for Joan, and I spent most of my early life until my early 20s in Ireland, and I think that has very much shaped me in terms of some of my core values, my sense of kinship with family, my sense of place, and the power of culture and folklore and music in particular to bind people together. And then in my mid-20s, I left Ireland and I have basically lived across four different continents now, and I started really on my journey to being a culture specialist and becoming very passionate about making workplaces better. So, yeah, I think my Irishness has very much shaped me, but I've now lived in Australia for more years than I've lived in any other country. So I see myself as both Irish and Australian now.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it, when you have this opportunity to really immerse yourself in different cultures, like you did, moving around and experiencing different ways of being and different ways of thinking. And I think it's
Absolutely.
so enriching for our personality and who we are. So it's great to hear that you've had these experiences. And I know that for many years, as you said, you've been working across these four continents and you've worked as a consultant, helping companies create more agile and more productive workplaces. And then
Right.
at some point, you reached sort of a turning point, really. So, what made you decide to go on the inside and be an executive who was in charge of culture change inside a company rather than consulting from the outside?
Yes, I did have this turning point in my career, Aga, when I was standing at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport after I'd spent a decade as a management consultant. So I was working at Accenture at the time, and I was looking back at my 10-year career as a change advisor and a culture change advisor in particular, and thinking how I loved consulting, but actually there was something missing from me. And I longed to go from an outsider to an insider and to actually implement the tools and all the advice that I'd been given. So at that stage, I decided to take a U-turn in my career and to become an insider. And I joined a series of large multinational organizations as the executive in charge of culture and change. And I've spent the last part of my career, the last 20 years actually, being an insider.
And one of these inside jobs was a really radical 7-year change initiative at Australia and New Zealand Banking Group, ANZ. And what it did, from what I know from your wonderful book, is it transformed the bank from the lowest performing bank in the country into the highest performing and most admired bank in the world. So could you paint the picture for us a little bit? What were the main cultural issues that the bank struggled with initially?
Mm. Yeah, so when I joined the bank in the early 2000s, a new CEO had come on board. His name was John McFarlane, and he walked into a storm essentially because the banks had been, in many ways, they'd lost the trust of the community that they served, and customer satisfaction was at an all-time low. And bank bashing had become a national sport in Australia. So everybody was complaining about the banks. And John McFarlane knew that he had to do more than just deliver the financial returns. He had to completely turn around the bank. So I joined the bank, and 3 years later, I became head of their culture change program, which was called Breakout. And essentially, one of the things that I noticed almost as soon as I walked into the bank was that they had branches. They had 700 branches, and they had head office. And there was this pattern or relatedness between head office and the branches that was very dysfunctional. And it was blaming each other for the lack of customer service or the poor customer service. So one part was saying to the other, you're to blame for the bad service. And the other part was saying, well, no, you're to blame. So head office were taking up the role of the order givers. So giving directions and orders to the branches. And the branches were taking up the role of order takers. So, and in between, there was this blame pattern. So that very dysfunctional pattern was actually running the bank. And we had to see that pattern and to be able to enable the leaders to step into a role to break that pattern in order to get the results that we got over a 7-year period, a radical turnaround.
I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are really tuning in now, because what you have just described in terms of that dynamic between the headquarters and the branches is something that is certainly happening at a lot of financial institutions that I know, but also a lot of other companies. And so I'm sure that people recognize that. So I want us to unpack that a little bit so that people can understand what exactly happened and what you did. So you mentioned the word patterns. You've noticed that pattern. And I know that it's a really important core element of your methodology now. So talk to us a little bit about why patterns are important and what are the ways to notice them.
Yes, great questions. And for me, at the heart of workplace culture are these patterns. They are the patterns of relating that determine how the organization operates. And patterns, as we know, they show up in nature. For example, if you look at the undulating sand in the Sahara Desert, if you look at the face of a sunflower or the stars in the Milky Way, each of these natural ecosystems is patterned, and they're governed by rules that allow you to predict how they will behave if you understand those underlying rules, those mathematical formulas. And the same is true in families. We know that family therapists see patterns, and we see patterns in families where over generations maybe a pattern of alcoholism might be passed down, or a pattern of abuse might be passed down through the generations. And then sometimes people can break out of these dysfunctional patterns and create a different life for themselves. So family therapists look at the whole family system. They don't just look at one person in the family. They look at the patterns within the family that is causing the dysfunctional behavior. And the same is true in organizations. We can't just single out single root causes for things. Culture is always co-created. It's always in the patterns. So I always say you have to tell or distinguish the dancer from the dance. So the dancers are the behaviors, but the dance is the pattern. So how can we identify those patterns that are running our organizations?
Yeah, that's wonderful. And thank you for giving all these examples, because it really helps, I think, to understand how, what to look for and what's the nature of culture and how it manifests itself. And I say what to look for because very often, and there are so many metaphors, right? That culture is like the wind or water to fish. It really can be invisible. And so I really appreciate your approach and helping organizations to see those cultural patterns, to identify them, and then identify ways of breaking out of them. So would you be able to walk us through the process that you've used to identify patterns in the bank? Because you mentioned that the moment you walked in, you've noticed that pattern of the blame game. So first question, because back then you were still an outsider who just walked in. So I think it's easier to notice those things when you are not part of the system. Did people who were part of the system realize that this pattern was taking place?
Not really, because when you're in the system, when you're in the organization, it's very easy to become blind to these patterns and caught by them. So it's a little bit like when you see a dysfunctional family, and as an outsider to the family, you can say, wow, that's quite dysfunctional, the behavior within their family. But within the family itself, often people can become blind to these dysfunctional ways because they are just normal for those people. roles. So within the bank, often it was people, and this happens very often in culture change, that people would try to fix the branches. So they would say, right, they need to go on customer service training. They are the problem, so let's give them some training, rather than actually notice the pattern of relatedness between the parts that was actually running the bank. So as an advisor, you've got to be able to step back and see the connectedness between the parts. How is the relatedness between the branches and head office? What is the role of the different parts? And what is the agreement between them? So the agreement between the parts was that we blame each other for the lack of customer service, and this blame goes round and round. So the first part is to see that pattern and not be caught by the pattern. And sometimes it does take an outsider, as you mentioned, to be able to do that successfully.
Absolutely. So, for the sake of our listeners, of course, we are not talking about explicit agreements. We're not agreeing to blame one another, but those are implicit agreements. And I think that there is some sort of payoffs that people or parties or the system gets from that dynamic going on. Simply easier sometimes to be
Absolutely.
able to point fingers at someone rather than do things, and it can feel quite limiting at the same time, because of course when people hold these beliefs that they don't have the power to change things, and it's, for example, the head office that has the power and doesn't do anything, it can feel extremely limiting. So I can only imagine that probably this is one of the reasons that the program was called Breakout. Was it about breaking out of that pattern?
Yes, breaking out of the old ways of thinking and the old ways of doing things. And in order to do that, it wasn't just about skills training. We had to fundamentally reshape how the organization functioned in order to reframe those roles. So essentially, we put a new operating model in place where we reframed the role of the head office from the order giver to the support enabler, or the support provider, or the enabler for the branches. So the head office began to see itself as an enabler, giving IT support, HR support, risk management support to the branches. And at the same time, we reframed the role of the branches from the order takers to the service providers to the customer. So they now stepped into the role of totally owning their local area, being responsible for the profits, for the margins, for the people, for the customer satisfaction. So a very big shift for them, where we appointed local CEOs to these local areas to essentially take charge of that area from end to end. So that change in the operating model was fundamental to shifting and reframing these roles and changing the relatedness between the branches and the head office.
And I think you are raising a really important point here, that a lot of conversations about culture never address, which is that actually the first thing that you did was not addressing behavioral issues. The first thing you did was look at the way the organization operates and introduce a new operating model to support the desired culture change. And so I want to ask you, is that the only way to bring about cultural change? Is that the only way to break out of these patterns? And one of the reasons that for this question is that I know that a large group of our listeners are people who are trapped somewhere at the middle levels of management. And very often they don't have the decision-making power to decide that we're going to change our operating model now. So talk to us a little bit about that dilemma.
Yes, it's a great question. And there are 4 steps that I talk about in my book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. And one of those steps is about reframing. So let me give you an example that's a little bit more manageable for those listeners who aren't running a bank 32,000 people. So I'll give you an example that's much more about a team and the power of reframing to bring about faster change with less noise. So I was working with a partner in a consulting firm. His name was Jonathan, and he was struggling with the fact that he'd lost the last 3 proposals in a row. And client feedback was indicating that they were looking for more nimble and agile and innovative solutions from him and his team. And he had tried various ways to create a more innovative culture within his team. So he'd rolled out new values, and he'd even introduced open plan environment to try and get people talking to each other and innovating more. But he just lost another big proposal when he called me. And one of the things that we discovered in our conversation, and one of the questions I asked him, because he was saying the consultants aren't innovative, they're really just not getting creative with their proposals and their ideas. And one of the ways that I explored that situation was not to go to the consultants. The tendency is to, well, let's go to the consultants, let's perhaps send them on innovation training because they're not innovative enough. But instead I brought him back to what are the roles and the relatedness between the parts. So I said, well, you're the managing partner. Can you take me back to the last proposal that you lost? Who signed off on that proposal? And he said, oh, well, I signed off on that proposal in my role as the managing partner. So he was in role of enabler, and they were in role of traditional thinkers. And the pattern or the relatedness between them was that it's okay to deliver traditional thinking around here. And therein lay the way to break that pattern was that Jonathan had to shift his role from enabler to innovation leader. And they had to shift their role from traditional thinkers to innovative thinkers and create a different pattern of relatedness between them. So he didn't need to restructure. He didn't need a new operating model. He just needed to realize that he was taking up a role that was fueling or co-creating the lack of innovation in his team, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense to me, and this is really brilliant. Why is it so much easier to shift and reframe the roles rather than people's personalities or even addressing behaviors directly?
So there are 3 key levers for changing or shaping or influencing behavior, or that influence our behavior. The first is our instincts, so the instincts to survive, or the instinct to eat, or the instinct to protect one's offspring. And these are very hardwired, but they do influence our behavior. But again, very hard to change your instinctual response. The second one, as you mentioned, Aga, is our personality. So our personality, whether we're outgoing or we're gregarious or we're generous or we have a trigger-haired temper, some of these things are personality-driven and, again, deeply wired and quite hard to change. And some would also argue, well, what right do we even have to try and change people's personality and who they are at work? And, what right do we have to even ask people to do that? But then the third way, and I think, sometimes the easier way, is to reframe the roles. So let me share a short story with you to illustrate what I mean by that. Sarah Connors is a doctor at a New York hospital, and she wakes up in the morning and kisses her husband, Mark, good morning, in role of partner and role of wife. Then she goes down the corridor and meets her 9-year-old twins, and she steps into role of mother. She gets on the train, goes into work. She steps into the role of commuter, and in work, she has a meeting in the morning with some first-year medical students. She steps into role of teacher. Later that morning, she meets with her boss and she steps into the role of negotiator to get some funding for some imaging machinery that she needs in her department. And then later that afternoon, she steps into role of advisor to a colleague who needs a second opinion on a medical diagnosis. That evening, she meets up with a friend who's going through a relationship breakup, and she steps into role of listener. So in each of those roles, Sarah is still Sarah. She's still her true, authentic self, but her behavior changes according to the role that she takes up. And this role change shifts her behavior very quickly. So we can use this technique of role and role reframing to bring about faster change with less noise, in my opinion.
I love that. And it makes so much sense to me. And also, it makes me curious. So, when you are trying to bring about organizational change and culture change, and you identify these patterns and you realize that the roles will need to be reframed and shifted,
Mm,
and you also identify what they need to be. I think the example that we can use, I really liked it with a bank, is shifting from the role of blamer or order giver to supporter on one side, and then from the role of blamer to the role of service provider to the
mm.
customers. How then do you support people stepping into these roles? Because I can only imagine that initially there must be a little bit of difficulty and perhaps a little bit of struggle to um, identify with this new dynamic and with this new role.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a great question. And it goes to the heart of role because in role reframing, essentially what you are doing is you are starting to examine and explore what are the mental maps that people hold about their role. And what is guiding their behavior is often an old mental map of the role. So mental maps are a little bit like the GPS in your car, and they guide you and they direct you, but sometimes the GPS can be outdated and it can take you up the
Mhm.
wrong track and down the wrong road. So in culture change, you often have to update or allow people to update their own mental maps of the role. So at the bank, for example, we needed to get the branch staff out of role of order taker and into role of service provider to the customer. So they had to each redraw their mental maps, and there were many ways that we did that. But two of the ones that were key were we changed the values of the organization. And one of the values, the 5 values that the bank introduced and John McFarlane introduced as the CEO, was that every single person out of the 32,000 employees should lead and inspire each other. So that value invited every person within the bank to step into their leadership role to be a service provider. So each person could be a leader in this culture change. And then the second thing that we did, and my team led all of this work, was we rolled out breakout workshops, we called them, to 32,000 people across the bank. So that was an enormous undertaking, but it gave these people, firstly, the different mental map of their role, and secondly, the tools that they needed to repair and build better relationships and to move out of the blame game and into working together. And actually, a third thing which was relevant to this question was we had another initiative called A Day in the Life, where people in head office had to spend a day at the branches, which sounds quite simple, but
Mhm.
actually it was incredibly eye-opening for these people who sat in head office all day and had never seen what a branch looked like. So they spent a day answering customer queries and trying to figure out what customer problems were and seeing the broken systems and the poor environment that the branch staff had to work in. And that led to an
Mm.
enormous shift in their role, seeing themselves as enablers. How could they step in to enable the branches to deliver better service to customers?
I love that. That's really fascinating. And of course, I can imagine that in that case, it was a journey. It took, I think, knowing from having read your book, it took around 7 years to
Mm.
see the results that you have seen. But I also know, and you do talk about this in your book, that some of these changes can come quite fast and, as you say, without much noise. So I'm curious, what were the first results that you've noticed, let's say in the first year of your work? What were the things that changed?
Yes, I think it's important to get to what I call critical mass within 18 months. So you've got to get to this tipping point or critical mass where people are moving with you rather than moving against you, because otherwise it can become, oh, well, that's just a fad, or it's not worth getting on board. And we definitely we reached that critical mass within 18 months. And it actually was triggered by the CEO, John McFarlane, making an announcement to the market. Um, he had had an agreement with the other CEOs that they wouldn't close down any more rural branches in Australia. So branches in country areas that people really depended on before the time of digital banking. And during that time, one of the competitor banks announced that it was going to close 53 branches in rural areas. And on that same day, John McFarlane at ANZ announced that he would buy those branches. So the people within the bank heard this announcement and they thought, this is a change I can believe in. This is a leader that I can trust. This is somebody who will deliver on their commitments. And that was a critical turning point where we reached critical mass. It was a tipping point or a turning point. And what we started to see, and it took some time, but customer satisfaction went up by 23%. Our cost to income ratio started to plummet, so it cost less. We were one of the most efficient banks in the world, at 45% cost to income ratio by the end of the journey. Employee engagement, when we first started the journey, over half the people at the bank didn't want to work there. And within a few years, we were trending within 2 years, actually, we had one of the highest levels of staff engagement out of any big bank in Australia and any big organisation in Australia and New Zealand. As I say, we were number one on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index globally as a financial organisation. So all of these metrics we tracked along the way, which is one of the key things during culture change. Often it's seen as something that's nebulous and hard to grasp, but with some creative thinking, you can always tie metrics to what you want to achieve. And for us, it was much more community and customer-centric bank that was more employee-centric as well. And there were ways of tracking those impacts on our multiple stakeholders, not just our financial results.
Which I think is really, really important, because you certainly don't want to get hung up only on, for example, on financial indicators when we are working on culture change. I think throughout your stories, one theme that I see is that there was a lot of commitment and support from top leadership for these changes and these transformations. So a question that comes to mind is, do you think that culture change on a large scale is possible without it being driven and sponsored by top leadership?
I think culture change does need all parts of the organization to step up and to adapt. But I also think that culture change is leader-led at all levels. So without the leaders stepping into their culture change role, it's likely that the change will not deliver on the expected benefits. I always say you can't delegate your change leadership role to HR, to champions, to change agents. And I see that, and you would too, probably in some organizations, people give culture change to human resources and it seldom works out. So culture change is leader-led in my view.
Absolutely. I think that has been my experience consistently with every single organization I've worked with. And it can be frustrating sometimes when you get the mandate from top leadership to do something about culture, but they're not willing to participate in the process and collaborate. So I can appreciate how hard it can be sometimes for those HR leaders to try and do something without the full buy-in and support from top leadership.
I was working at an infrastructure company, and it was my first week there. And I was I was meeting with each of the executive team to talk about the culture change that was required, and the company needed to create a much more accountable and commercial culture in a more competitive environment. And I was meeting with the CFO, and we had a very good hour conversation. And for him, it was very clear that the organization needed to change the culture to become more commercial and performance driven. And at the end of the hour, he stood up and I stood up, and we shook hands, and he wished me good luck with changing the culture. And I realized as he shook my hand, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. He thinks it's my job alone to change the culture. And that was such important data for me, because one of the first conversations I had at the executive team based on that was not to step into the role, well, it's my job to fix the culture. It was to engage the executive team in a conversation about whose role is it to do what during culture change. And of course, HR has a critical role to play in the provision of guidance and support and advice and processes. They can take up their leadership role, but managers who lead people also have a critical leadership role to play. But those role distinctions aren't often talked about or understood across organizations at the start of culture change. Would you agree from your experience, Aga?
Absolutely. I do agree. And what I also see is that these conversations about the roles that everyone's going to have during culture evolution process are sometimes really difficult conversations for people to have. So I'm wondering whether you have any advice for fellow culture consultants or fellow HR or culture professionals within organizations. What would you say is a good approach with your top leadership team to have this conversation about their role in the process and how they need to see themselves as change leaders?
It's a great question, and it goes back to my earlier point about the elements of culture. So I would be exploring with the executive team, what is their mental map of this culture change, and who is in that mental map? Because when you're instigating culture change, there are many different parts of the organization that must shift. For example, there is the board. What is the role of the board in relation to the culture change? What is the role of the CEO? That's another little subsystem. What is the role of the executive team? What is the role of the extended leadership team? What is the role of each of the department heads? What is the role of the HR team? What is the role of the change agent team? What is the role of marketing, sales, R&D, manufacturing? So you could draw the mental map of the whole organization or system, as the system thinkers would say, and begin to map out the role relatedness between them. So what is keeping this culture locked in? And what are the roles that they're in currently that they need to move out of? So in a very objective way, you could draw the mental map, the collectively held mental map, like at the ANZ example, you would draw the CEO, you would draw the leadership group, you would draw the top executive 600. There was a top 600. Then you would draw the branches and the head office and start to see the organization and see the roles and the patterns of relatedness between the parts. And then once you see the pattern, then people can step into the role breaking those patterns. But again, this would be CEO led and facilitator enabled. So a lot of the work would be even mapping this out with the CEO beforehand so that he or she understands where you're taking this intervention. I would call that an intervention. So not doing it to the CEO, but teaming up with the CEO to say, this is what I'm seeing. Is this what you're seeing? This is what we could draw. This is where we need people to step into. So he or she is on the journey with you. You're not having to surprise them in a meeting where you suddenly reveal that the CEO has been co-created. Like Jonathan in our example, I met with him beforehand. He saw that he was taking up the role of enabler and that he needed to change his role to innovation leader in order to create a more innovative culture in the consulting firm. But I didn't surprise him. I took him with me, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm curious whether you have any advice for people on how to develop these skills to take your CEO on this journey when you are working within an organization. I definitely would say that a huge help for people is going to be reading your book, An Insider's Guide to Culture Change. So definitely get the book. You will learn a lot from that. But I'm curious, Siobhan, whether you have any other recommendations on how to build the skill set that will enable you to facilitate that change from within an organization.
Yes, I think I think one of the things that I have noticed is that we have been trained to think in terms of linear cause and effect, root cause analysis. So we often go into situations like with Jonathan and his team looking for, well, where is the issue? Where who is not at fault, but where does the issue lie here? And the tendency is to go to the consultants, the team are the issue, and let's send them on training. And I think part of it is continuing to step back onto the balcony and to see the bigger picture, to see the relatedness, and to, the first thing would be to team up with people who are thinking in this way, and to start to get groups around you who can start to map the organization, map the parts. It's like a muscle. You have to build this muscle, and the only way to do that is to not dive into a solution as quickly as maybe we've been taught. We go into very quick, we need to send them on innovation training. That's the solution. We need to spend more time in the first step of culture transformation, which is diagnose. We've got to really diagnose what is truly going on, and spend time with others diagnosing and drawing maps of what's going on and what are the roles and the relatedness. So I'd say team up with other people, start to develop that muscle. I think other people are joining this movement of seeing things not in linear mechanical ways, but seeing the patterns and the relatedness. There is a movement being created in this direction. So joining up with others.
Yes, definitely. And there are plenty of wonderful books about systems thinking. And I think that can be of a huge help as well, because as you say, since we've been socialized for most of our lives to think in a linear way, we need a little bit of help to start noticing systems. And I think my journey with systems thinking has lasted for the past, I'd say, perhaps 7 years. And it's incredible how my perception has changed when I was first introduced to this notion that actually it's not about George and John in the Beatles so much as it is about the relationship and the dynamic and what happens between them, because this is what makes the Beatles. It's not the individuals. And so it really is fascinating. So I'd encourage people really to dive into that discipline of systems thinking and start noticing systems around you. As you say, in families, in friends groups, everywhere you go, you start seeing systems. It's incredible.
It is. I agree with you, Aga.
So, Siobhan, we have a section on the podcast which is called Rapid Fire Questions. And the whole idea is that I ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and we will aim at answering these questions in under 2 minutes. So, 5 questions in 2 minutes. Okay?
Excellent. Go for it.
Okay, fantastic. So let's go for it. All right. So the first question is, how do you define organizational culture?
The patterns of thinking and relating that govern how the organization operates.
And what would you say are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
The key sign for me is persistent noise. So whenever you get noise that is reoccurring and persistent, that doesn't seem to go away, it's usually a culture problem.
Oh, I love it. It's such a unique answer. I've never had it before, and it's so true. And what company do you admire for their culture, if there is one? And I'm sure you admire yours, but apart from DuluxGroup, are there any other companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
I was going to say DuluxGroup, so you took the words out of my mouth. And because we do have a high-performing culture, actually, we were over the last 9 years, where we were the 3rd highest performing company on the Australian Stock Exchange while we were listed on it. And so it's a high-performing culture, but also a very friendly culture, which is hard to get the combination of both. Sometimes you can get one, but not the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's
difficult to hit that sweet spot. Southwest?
Yes, because they're so renowned.
So I'm going to plug your book again, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. Definitely, I would encourage our listeners to get it when it's out. But apart from your book, what books on culture and on leadership would you recommend to our listeners?
A seminal book for me was Carolyn Taylor's Walking the Talk on culture change, and I still would recommend it, even though it was first released in 2005. It's just one of those perennials that was very influential in my life. So Walking the Talk, Carolyn Taylor.
Wonderful. We'll put it in the show notes for our listeners. And finally, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
The power of stepping into your culture role cannot be underestimated. A lot of leaders take up their role to run the business. I would also encourage them not just to be in their operational role, but to be in their culture role. The power of framing your role as a culture leader and taking up that role and fully stepping into that role it's very powerful, I believe.
So finally, Siobhan, what are the closing remarks that you would like to leave our listeners with?
I would say one of my sayings is be brave enough to swim against the tide of a dysfunctional culture. Be brave enough to swim against the tide, because it is often a tide of a dysfunctional culture, and figure out how you might do that in a safe way.
Yes.
Break the patterns.
I love that. Yes. I love that. And it's so much aligned with my work and what I encourage people to do as well. So it's a beautiful way to capture that message. Thank you for that. One last question from me is, who would you recommend as a wonderful guest on the podcast? Someone who really has interesting things to say about culture change, about how to build a work environment that works and enables people to do the best work.
Gary Ridge, who's the CEO of WD-40, is
We've had him already.
Oh, you've had him already? Oh,
yes.
He is amazing. He's one of my favorites because he's done it. He's been there. He's done it. And the other one would be John McFarlane, who was the CEO of ANZ Bank. It's just been announced that he is now going to become chairman of Westpac. He has been the chairman of Barclays Bank in the UK. So he's been there, he's done it, he's transformed organizations. I've worked with him.
Oh, I would love to have him.
He's fascinating.
Yes, that's such a great idea. Thank you for that recommendation. Wonderful. I think after everything that we've discussed, our listeners will want to know where should they go to learn more about you, about your work. So what are the best places online or in real life where people could reach out to you and learn from you?
LinkedIn is probably the place where I show up most, and I would recommend they message me on LinkedIn and connect with me in that way. That's where I publish stuff, and just if they're interested, just connect with me on that platform.
Wonderful. That's how I met you.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity with your time and with your experiences and your knowledge and the methodologies that you've developed. I think it's really incredibly important to share this because the world needs that knowledge and that know-how. We're certainly on the mission on the podcast, the whole team, to help people get a handle on culture. And I think you are one of the leaders in this area. You really help people understand how culture works and what are the ways of harnessing its power. So thank you for the work that you are doing.
Oh, thank you, Aga.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, content editor.
Sound producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. And now it's time for the preview of the upcoming episode. And my next guest is the incredible Nikki Gattenby, who until recently was the Chief Growth Officer at PropellerNet and the co-founder and CEO at Search Listening. A few days ago, she announced that she leaves PropellerNet to embark on a new journey as the non-executive director and coach at Gattenby's Consulting. In this short preview, Nikki talks about why she believes there's a better way to run a business than the one that we got used to over the past few decades. Listen in.
Businesses are pushing people too hard and too far. Lawyers, city bankers, junior doctors, and tech startup employees are all renowned for being overworked and outworking each other. So I believe there's a better way to run a business, one that puts people and purpose first and on a par with profit, rather than in pursuit of profit alone. Because if you treat people like battery hens, aiming for high productivity over long hours in confined spaces, it's just not going to work. So at PropellerNet, we know that squeezing more and more out of tired people isn't going to light anyone's fire. So well-being isn't a string of tactical activities that tick a CSR box. It's the core of what we stand for. It's the foundation of our people-first strategy. And it's not just what we do on our staff jollies, but it's how we work day in, day out, and that's make life better in action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.